Mr. Richard Damania is the Chief Economist for the Sustainable Development Division at the World Bank and will give us his keynote speech that outlines the goals we are seeking to achieve. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning, everyone in Korea. Like my colleague Kurt Yegan said, I wish very much I could be with you today, but hopefully very soon we will be able to meet in person. What I'd like to do today is to briefly discuss why it is that we are in the state that we are in, that we find ourselves, and how it is that we can actually get ourselves out of this fix and out of this trouble and prioritize what we actually need to do. And indeed, 2020, we experienced a year like no other. How did this happen? Are we on the right path, or are we hurtling down in the wrong direction? To answer this question, we have to step back a little bit and understand how it is we actually got here. We need to understand how it is that economies actually grow and develop. Any economy that you have will have a portfolio of assets, human capital, physical capital, natural capital, and social capital. The way a country grows and develops will depend on how you invest in these assets, in these capitals. And indeed, they're interconnected. If we build a dam or a seawall, it protects us from floods and it gives us resilience. If we pollute the air, this affects human health and so human capital and economic performance. So let's take a global look, a snapshot. How has the world performed in terms of this balancing act of development and investing in its many capitals? Let's start by taking any measure you wish of human capital or physical capital. It doesn't matter what measure you take. Let's start with child mortality rates. If you look at this red triangle that you see on your screen on the left, that tells you the infant mortality rates that we have experienced before COVID hit. And what you see is a dramatic decline in infant mortality rates over the century. We've done very, very well. Education is really, really important. If we look at literacy rates, so this orange triangle on the right of your screen, about 50 years ago, 1 in every 2 people that you would have met would have been functionally illiterate. Today, that number is less than 20% of people who are functionally illiterate. That is progress. If we look at poverty rates, in 1980, 40% of people in this world were defined as being extremely poor. Today, that number is down to less than 9%. That is, of course, before COVID hit. If we look at transport, it's the same thing. Transport costs have declined very, very dramatically over time as well. We are very good at building roads and communications. Water, today 75% of the world has access to some water, not as clean or as much as we desire, but some water for sure. Over 90% of the world has access to some electricity as well. In other words, while it's been halting, sometimes we've had recessions and gone backwards, but on average, over the last 50 years, we've made very good progress in terms of human capital before COVID hit and physical capital before COVID hit. Let's now turn our attention to natural capital. Take any measure of natural capital you like, air, land, or water. Let's start with the vital statistics of the planet. Nothing could be more important than climate change. We have seen carbon dioxide rates increase. Then physics and science tells us that temperatures must rise. If the world gets hotter, ice will melt and sea levels will rise. None of this is good. Take any other measure. Let's, for example, look at water quality. There's thousands of measures of water quality. These are measures that are defined in the SDG 6.3. And you see red bits where the water quality is very bad in some of the richest countries in the world, some of the poorest countries, hot countries, cold countries. In some, globally, water quality is in decline. If we look at deforestation rates, you'll see the dots coming up over the last 10 years. Deforestation is on the increase. And after COVID, it's increased 80% more year on year than before COVID. Things are getting worse, not better. Air pollution, all of you will know, is a very big killer. Today, air pollution claims more lives than do all wars. And if we look at income inequality, it doesn't matter what measure you take. This is the share of income of the top 10%. We see that the world is becoming more and more unequal. It doesn't matter what measure you take. And then came COVID-19. It was a game changer. It hit the world very, very hard. We had a health crisis. Human capital was in decline. Remember, COVID is a zoonotic disease. It told us that our growth is unbalanced. We're getting a spillover from natural assets into human health and then into economic performance. And we've seen something we've never seen before. 100 million people or more infected, well over 2 million people dead. For the first time ever, poverty is on the increase. At least 130 million more people have entered poverty. And with Mark II of COVID getting worse, we know many, many more people will enter into poverty. And the deforestation is continuing. All of this is a sign of unbalanced development. So how has the world responded? How green or good has been the stimulus plans? Now, this is work done by the very famous economist Nick Stern's consultancy group called Vivid Economics. Just look at the green bars across countries. They're pretty small compared to the brown bars that we see. In other words, in most countries, the stimulus package is not as green as we would like it to be. We could do better. And it is in this context that the World Bank Group has put out a paper for recovering better, for doing better, and it uses the acronym, the short title of GRID. And by the way, this is a picture of the World Bank office, which is sadly empty because of COVID. GRID stands for Green, Resilient, and Inclusive Development. And indeed, as Jürgen said, GRID is no different what we are recommending from what we call green growth. Sometimes people call it the reset. It's the same ambition of getting to net zero CO2 emissions. If we want to go green, if we want to reset our economies, what is it that we have to do? There are 4 critical ingredients to going green. Without that, we will not build better. The risks will be the same. First, as my colleague Jürgen told you, is resilience, inclusion, sustainability, and efficiency. Why these 4 and none others? Resilience. We live in a world of multiple catastrophes and crises. COVID, a recession that's deeper than we've seen in a long time. Climate change, in Africa, locusts, floods. If we don't build resilience to these threats, which are often predictable, we will keep going backwards for every step we take forwards. So resilience is critical to growth. Inclusion. We start with extremely high baseline inequality. If the inequality gets worse, we know social capital will be in decline and we get social descent. Sustainability is critical. Tomorrow, the world will have more debt and will be poorer. We should not put even more environmental debt on future generations, so we need to do no future harm. And efficiency is vital because countries are indebted, so they need to make every penny count. They need to spend wisely and they need to use their resources wisely. We can think of these 4 dimensions as being elements of the quality of growth that actually sustains growth itself. If any of these crumbles and falls, we know that growth will go backwards, development will go backwards. It's all very well talking about it, but can we measure and quantify the performance of countries along these 4 dimensions, if you like, of the quality of growth or greening growth? What we've done in the World Bank, and thanks to support from the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund, is build what is perhaps the largest data set that exists on these four critical elements of greening growth. And we have developed a methodology to work out how well a country does on each of these elements. So for each country, we ask, what are the key problems? Where does the shoe pinch? Why does it matter in your country? And how can we address those problems? Let me give you a very, very quick snapshot before I end of how all of this works. Let's start with resilience, which we know is so critical. When we think about resilience, we want measures of the population affected by natural disasters, the amount of land, for example, that might be exposed to droughts, risk to assets, risks to human beings and well-being, and of course, food security. In this example, in this flower diagram, we compare this country, I won't tell you what country it is, country X, to the best performer in each of these categories in its income group, which is a lower middle income country. And from a glance, you see the bigger the petal, the better is the performance. So we see this country is doing very well on food security. Not much of its population is affected by natural disasters. It has a bit of a problem with urban slums. And we have about 40 measures of resilience that we can use. But this is just a snapshot. But overall, this country is doing not badly in resilience. When we think of inclusion, what would we want to see in measures of inclusion? Clearly, the level of inequality. That's measured by something called a Gini index. Clearly, you want to know how many people are poor. You also want to know their access to basic services, like, for example, water, health services, education services. And you also want measures that I've not shown over here of social capital, of things like the amount of trust, the amount of crime, and so on. And we can measure how countries do compared to the best performer in its field or anyone else. If we look at this country X, it's the same country, we see it has a deep problem in terms of water, and it's got a pretty bad problem in terms of inequality. Sustainability. We have measures of land, air, and water. And in this country, we see that the air pollution measure, PM 2.5, close to zero. There's no color there, terrible air quality. And its water is pretty terrible too. There's no color over there. In terms of forest loss, not too bad at all. And efficiency. How well are you using your natural resources like your land? How well are you using your water? How productive are your workers? How much greenhouse gas emissions do you get for each unit of GDP that you produce? For every dollar that you spend in the public domain, do you spend it wisely or does it get wasted? We measure all of these things in the efficiency pillar. And then we can put all of this together and we can compare countries to anyone that you like. So this country, country X, is in the blue. And you see in terms of resilience, as we saw, it doesn't do very badly, even though it's a poor African country. It's almost as resilient as the average high-income country. That's what HIC stands for. If we look at inclusion, not too bad. Sustainability, terrible. It's worse than any other group that you can find. Efficiency, also not too bad. So repeatedly, no matter who we measure this country against, sustainability is a problem, and we also know why it is a problem, what's driving it. So then, once we know what's driving the problem, we can do a deep dive, and we can work out exactly where the problem lies and why it is happening. Once you've done that, the next thing is to say, well, how can I make things better? And what we've also done, and I think this is the first time that this has been done, is to try to help countries make sure that they don't inadvertently, without meaning to, spend on brown things and things that might do harm to the environment and also distribution. So for every sector in the economy, for every country in the world, developing country in the world, for $1 million that you spend, we can work out how many jobs do you get per million, who gets those jobs, males, females, high skill, low skill, how much GDP do you get per dollar spent, what is the environmental impact? We focus on greenhouse gases. So we developed this using something called CGE modeling with a group experts in Purdue University that have this data set, which is almost a common language for CGE analysis, called GTAP. So it's very well known, it's reliable, and this is a useful data set for any country that wants to use it, and it's publicly available. We also know that countries are constrained in their use of resources. So we ask the question, how efficiently is your country using resources? For example, we know water is free. Because water is free, we use it wastefully. And what we do is we measure the efficiency relative to the frontier. And these dots are different countries that we actually have in Asia. And indeed, one of them is Korea. But I'm not going to tell you where Korea is, but it performs very well, I assure you. And here we are measuring the economic returns you get from land against the carbon sequestration of that land. So is there a trade-off? Or are you actually on the frontier? And we find out very, very few countries are actually on the frontier. So then once we've worked all of this out, we can come up with policy solutions. We know whether the shoe is pinching in terms of resilience, inclusion, sustainability, or efficiency. And we have a targeted basket of solutions. And indeed, we reach out into the experience of Korea and the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund to see how we can come up with innovative solutions. And so just to sum up now, we know that the size of the cake, quantity of growth, is very, very important. Poor countries especially clearly need to grow, but the quality of growth is very important too. Indeed, it is as important. Otherwise, many people can go backwards. And we also know that no one number like GDP can capture all dimensions of development and growth that we desire. So what we've done is we've come up with a set of publicly available statistics to capture the quality of growth together with the quantity of growth and tell you where it is you're either leading or lagging and where you need to put more effort and more investment and how you actually do it. Hopefully, if we start doing this across the world, we will come to a much better world that is resilient, inclusive, sustainable, and efficient. That would be the green growth that we want. Thank you so much.